In November 1956, the British Empire collapsed in 72 hours. Not from military defeat, not from revolution, but from a phone call. President Eisenhower picked up the telephone and told British Prime Minister Anthony Eden that America would dump its holdings of British pound sterling bonds unless Britain withdrew from Egypt immediately. Within 3 days, the most powerful empire in human history, one that controlled a quarter of the Earth's landmass, was forced into a humiliating retreat that marked its end as a global superpower. It wasn't bombs that destroyed the British Empire. It wasn't even the 2 world wars. It was debt. It was currency weakness. It was the fatal mistake of believing that military power could exist without economic strength to back it up. The Suez Crisis wasn't the cause of Britain's collapse. It was the trigger that exposed a pattern of imperial overreach that had been building for decades. And right now, the exact same pattern is unfolding in the United States of America. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. Economic historians have identified a 5-stage pattern that appears before every major imperial collapse in recorded history, what scholars now call the Imperial Overreach Spiral. Let me show you how it works. The pattern is mathematical, it's predictable, and according to research from institutions including the London School of Economics and Harvard's Kennedy School, it has preceded the fall of every major empire from Rome to the Soviet Union. Here are the 5 stages. Stage 1 is currency supremacy. An empire's currency becomes the dominant medium of international exchange, and other nations hold it as a reserve. This creates what economists call exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money that other countries must accept. Stage 2 is military overextension. Confident in its currency power, the empire expands its military commitments globally. It stations troops on foreign soil, fights wars in distant lands, and promises protection to dozens of allies. The military budget grows far beyond what the domestic economy can sustainably support. Stage 3 is deficit financing. Unable to fund its commitments through taxation alone, the empire begins running massive deficits. It borrows from other nations, prints currency, and tells itself that its special status makes normal economic rules irrelevant. Debt to GDP ratios climb past sustainable levels. Stage 4 is creditor tension. Nations holding the empire's currency begin to worry. They see the deficits, they watch the military failures, and they start quietly diversifying, buying gold, making bilateral trade deals in other currencies, forming alternative financial systems. The empire dismisses these moves as insignificant. Stage 5 is the trigger event. A single geopolitical crisis, often a small one, forces the empire to choose between its military commitments and its economic stability. Creditor nations make demands, and the empire discovers it can no longer finance its power. The illusion shatters in days or weeks. What took decades to build collapses in months. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And this pattern has played out with mechanical precision across civilizations separated by centuries and continents. Let's examine the historical record. Rome from 235 to 476 AD. Stage 1. The Roman denarius was the reserve currency of the Mediterranean world for over 400 years. Trade from Britain to Persia was conducted in Roman coin. Stage 2. By the 3rd century AD, Rome maintained 30 legions, approximately 150,000 troops, stationed across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. According to Oxford historian Peter Heather, the military consumed nearly 75% of imperial revenue. Stage 3. Unable to fund the military through taxation, emperors began debasing the currency. The silver content of the denarius dropped from 95% under Augustus to less than 5% by 270 AD. Inflation exploded. The government printed worthless coins to pay soldiers. Stage 4. Border provinces began refusing Roman currency. Germanic tribes demanded payment in gold, not debased silver. Trade networks fractured. According to archaeological evidence, coin hoards, a sign of lost confidence in currency, increased 400% during this period. Stage 5. The trigger came in waves. Gothic invasions, Persian wars, internal civil conflicts. Rome couldn't afford to defend all frontiers simultaneously. In 410 AD, Visigoths sacked Rome itself. The Western Empire fell in 456 AD, not to a single battle, but to economic collapse that made defense impossible. Outcome? The greatest empire of the ancient world fragmented into warring kingdoms. It took Europe 1,000 years to recover the economic sophistication Rome had achieved, but the pattern appeared again. Spain from 1556 to 1640. Stage 1. Spanish silver from the Americas became the world's money. The Spanish Real de Ocho, the Peace of Eight, was legal tender from Manila to Mexico City to Madrid. Stage 2. Spain maintained the largest military empire on earth. Armies in the Netherlands, fleets in the Caribbean, garrisons in Italy. According to research from the University of Cambridge, Spanish military expenditures increased 500% between 1556 and 1598. Stage 3. Despite silver mines producing over 150 tons annually, Spain ran perpetual deficits. King Philip II declared bankruptcy in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. The government borrowed at interest rates exceeding 40%. Stage 4. By 1600, Spanish silver was flowing directly from American mines to Chinese merchants and European creditors. Spain saw almost none of it. Dutch and English merchants began trading in their own currencies. The arbitrage was obvious. Spain was exporting wealth to finance commitments it couldn't afford. Stage 5. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 was the trigger. Spain simply couldn't fund simultaneous conflicts across Europe. In 1640, Portugal and Catalonia rebelled. Spain couldn't afford to suppress both. The empire began its terminal decline. Outcome. By 1700, Spain had lost the Netherlands, Portugal, and its position as Europe's dominant power. A nation sitting on history's greatest silver deposits ended up broke. The pattern repeated in the 20th century. The Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. Stage 1. The ruble was the reserve currency of the communist bloc, obligatory for trade among Warsaw Pact nations and Soviet client states across 3 continents. Stage 2. The USSR maintained over 40,000 tanks, 5 million active military personnel, and troops stationed from East Germany to Cuba to Afghanistan. According to CIA estimates, military spending consumed 15 to 20% of Soviet GDP, compared to 6% for the United States. Stage 3. Oil revenues masked the underlying crisis during the 1970s, but by 1980, Soviet debt to Western banks exceeded $27 billion. When oil prices collapsed in 1985 and 1986, the government was printing rubles to pay for everything from bread subsidies to ballistic missiles. Stage 4. By 1989, Eastern European nations were abandoning the ruble for Western currencies. According to Yegor Gaidar, Soviet finance minister during the collapse, grain imports were being paid for with emergency gold sales. The USSR was liquidating strategic reserves to buy food. Stage 5. The trigger was the Afghan war coupled with the collapse of oil prices. In 1989, the Soviet government couldn't suppress rebellions in Eastern Europe and fund its domestic economy simultaneously. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Outcome? A nuclear superpower with 40,000 warheads dissolved in less than 3 years. The ruble lost 99.9% of its value. Pensioners starved. Regional powers emerged from the wreckage. But none of these examples compare to what happened to Britain in 1956. Britain from 1945 to 1956. Stage 1. The British pound sterling had been the world's reserve currency since the 1800s. According to the Bank of England, over 60% of international trade settlements were conducted in pounds as late as 1945. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 established the dollar as co-equal with sterling. Stage 2. Despite being bankrupt after World War II, Britain maintained over 1 million troops stationed globally in Germany, Malaysia, Kenya, Cyprus, and the Middle East. The military consumed 10% of GDP, the highest peacetime ratio in British history. Stage 3, Britain's national debt exceeded 250% of GDP in 1945. According to Treasury records, the government was borrowing from the United States just to maintain food rations. The $3.75 billion loan from America in 1946 came with humiliating conditions. Britain had to make the pound convertible to dollars, exposing its weakness. Stage 4. By 1955, central banks were quietly shifting reserves from pounds to dollars. Britain was hemorrhaging gold. In the first half of 1956 alone, the Bank of England lost $500 million in reserves, nearly 20% of its total holdings. Stage 5. The Suez Crisis was the trigger. In October 1956, Britain and France invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal after Nasser nationalized it. Eisenhower was furious he hadn't been consulted. On November 6, Eisenhower instructed the Treasury to prepare to dump Britain's bonds. The pound went into free fall. The Bank of England was losing $15 million in reserves per hour. Prime Minister Eden called Washington desperate. Eisenhower's message was clear. Withdraw from Egypt, or America lets the pound collapse. Britain had no choice. The withdrawal order came on November 6th. By November 7th, British and French troops were pulling out in humiliation. Outcome? Britain's status as a great power ended in 72 hours. According to historian David Kinniston, Harold Macmillan, who would become Prime Minister, said it was the moment of truth when Britain realized it could never again defy American wishes. The empire was over. The lesson was unmistakable. Military power without currency strength is an illusion. Your allies become your masters the moment you need their money. Now here's where it gets disturbing. Every single stage of this pattern is present in the United States today. Stage 1. Currency supremacy. Complete. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency since Bretton Woods in 1944. According to the International Monetary Fund, 58% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars as of 2024. Every barrel of oil traded globally is priced in dollars. Every central bank holds treasury bonds. This gives America what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called exorbitant privilege in 1965, the ability to print money the world must accept. But that privilege is eroding. Stage 2. Military overextension. Complete. The United States maintains over 750 military installations in more than 80 countries. According to the Department of Defense, 173,000 active duty troops are stationed on foreign soil. America has security commitments to NATO's 31 members, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and dozens more. The defense budget for 2024 exceeded $886 billion. That's more than the next 10 nations combined. But here's what the headlines miss. According to the Watson Institute at Brown University, total spending on post-9/11 wars alone has exceeded $8 trillion when accounting for veterans' care and interest on borrowed funds. The parallel to 3rd century Rome is mathematical. The United States is promising military protection it cannot indefinitely afford to deliver. Stage 3, deficit financing, complete. U.S. national debt exceeded $34 trillion in 2024. That's 122% of GDP, higher than any point except the immediate aftermath of World War II. And it's accelerating. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government ran a deficit of $1.7 trillion in fiscal year 2023. That deficit was financed entirely by borrowing. The government is selling bonds to pay for current operations. The textbook definition of unsustainable. Here's the number that should terrify you. By 2026, the CBO projects that interest payments on the debt will exceed $1 trillion annually. That's more than the entire defense budget. America will be paying more to service past borrowing than to fund its current military. Spain in 1600 faced the same arithmetic. So did Britain in 1956. The numbers didn't work then. They don't work now. Stage 4. Creditor tension. Complete. This is the stage most Americans don't see because it's happening in foreign capitals and central bank meeting rooms. China has reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to under $850 billion in 2024. Japan, the largest foreign holder, has stopped increasing its positions. According to the Treasury Department, foreign official holdings of U.S. debt have flatlined since 2021. But it's not just about bonds. It's about the architecture of global finance itself. In 2023, over 20 countries formally applied to join the BRICS alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Saudi Arabia is negotiating oil sales to China in yuan, not dollars. The UAE is accepting rupees for oil. According to Bloomberg, the share of global transactions conducted in yuan increased 327% between 2020 and 2024. These aren't accidents, they're preparations. Russia and China have been building alternative payment systems. CIPS for China, SPFS for Russia, specifically designed to bypass SWIFT and the dollar. After the U.S. froze Russian central bank reserves in 2022, every other nation saw the message: dollar reserves are only yours until Washington decides otherwise. The parallels are mathematical. In 1955, central banks quietly shifted from pounds to dollars. In 2024, central banks are quietly shifting from dollars to gold, yuan, and bilateral arrangements. Gold purchases by central banks hit a 55-year high in 2023, according to the World Gold Council. Stage 5, the trigger event, loading. This is the stage that hasn't happened yet, but the mechanisms are in place. Imagine this scenario. A crisis in Taiwan escalates. The United States threatens military intervention. China, which holds $850 billion in treasuries and clears trillions in dollar transactions, responds not with missiles, but with a financial ultimatum. Beijing announces it will dump U.S. bonds and prohibit Chinese companies from using dollars for trade settlement. Other BRICS nations follow. Within hours, treasury yields spike. The dollar plunges. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice: raise interest rates to defend the currency and crash the economy, or print money to buy the bonds and trigger hyperinflation. This isn't speculation. It's the same playbook Eisenhower used against Britain in 1956. The phone call. The ultimatum. The forced retreat. Or consider Ukraine. The conflict has cost the U.S. over $100 billion in direct aid since 2022. If the war expands or drags on another 5 years, and China increases support for Russia, while simultaneously pressuring Taiwan, America faces the Soviet problem of 1989. Too many commitments, insufficient resources. The trigger doesn't have to be dramatic. Britain's Suez moment started over a canal. The USSR's trigger was falling oil prices and a war in Afghanistan. The trigger just has to force the question: can you afford your empire? Right now, as I'm recording this, America is one crisis away from discovering the answer is no. Based on current trajectories and historical precedent, the United States will face its Suez moment between 2026 and 2029. The Congressional Budget Office's own projections show interest payments exceeding defense spending by 2026. That's the mathematical tipping point, when you're paying more for past debts than current power. When the trigger comes, whether it's Taiwan, Ukraine, a debt ceiling crisis that foreign creditors don't believe will be resolved, or something we haven't imagined, the sequence will unfold with stunning speed. First, bond yields will spike as creditors demand higher interest for perceived risk. The Federal Reserve will face its impossible choice. The government will discover that running trillion-dollar deficits only works if someone is willing to finance them. Then comes the pullback. Not because of defeat on a battlefield, but because the money runs out. Military commitments will be abandoned. Alliances will dissolve. The troops will come home, not in victory, but in forced contraction. The people who got destroyed in 1956 weren't stupid. Anthony Eden was a sophisticated statesman. The British Treasury had competent economists. They simply refused to believe that economic reality could override military and political will. They learned otherwise in 72 hours. The people who watched the Soviet Union collapse in 1991 weren't idiots. Soviet generals had thousands of nuclear weapons. The KGB had agents across the world. But when creditors stopped accepting rubles and the government couldn't pay for both guns and butter, the superpower vanished in less than 3 years. Nobody warned the British middle class that their empire would end over a canal in Egypt. Nobody told Soviet citizens in 1988 that their nation would cease to exist by 1991. And nobody is warning the American public that the same pattern, the Imperial Overreach Spiral, is in its final stage right now. This is educational content, not financial advice. I'm not telling you what to do with your investments or how to prepare. I'm showing you the pattern that has destroyed every empire in recorded history when they made the same choices America is making today. The British pound was the world's reserve currency for a century. It lost that status in a week. The Soviet ruble was mandatory for 1 billion people. It became worthless in 3 years. History doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care about exceptionalism or military technology or political will. It just runs the numbers. And right now, America's numbers look exactly like Britain's in 1955, Spain's in 1620, and Rome's in 250 AD. The phone call is coming. The only question is whether it comes from Beijing, Moscow, Riyadh, or all three at once. And when it does, the illusion will shatter in days, just like it did for every empire before. The pattern is complete. The stages are loaded. The trigger is preparing. History never asks permission. It just repeats. This video is for educational and historical purposes only and does not constitute a financial, investment, or political advice. All data cited is from publicly available sources, including the Congressional Budget Office, Federal Reserve, International Monetary Fund, Department of Defense, and academic historical research. Viewers should conduct their own research and consult qualified professionals before making any financial decisions